So, I am really excited to share with you all the things that we are learning from the female leaders through our series called Ladies Leading. I know many of you have been following along. My name is Jessica Gendron Williams, and I serve as the host of Ladies Leading. I'm also the CEO and president of the Center for Leadership Excellence, who sponsors the series as well. When we embarked on this journey to tell the stories of female leaders, one of the things I think is important for you to know is that um, I was really frustrated at that point in time that there weren't really a lot of great stories of female leaders. There were all these great highlights of male leaders and their success and all these really successful businesses. But what seemed lacking were stories of female leaders. And there were stories of female leaders sort of out in the space, but they were like these really wildly successful female leaders like Sarah Blakely and Sheryl Sandberg, who are great examples of successful female leadership. But for most of us women, that type of leadership sometimes feels a little out of reach. It feels a little unattainable. And for me, what I was really searching for was examples and stories of female leaders like me. At the time, I was a CEO of another company and sort of transitioning into a new role and was really feeling alone in my experiences. I didn't have a lot of people to talk to that were other female leaders who could validate or tell me I was experiencing things that were unique. And what I really wanted is for more women to have more examples of successful female leaders like them in things that felt really accessible. The second thing was I was reading this book called Essentialism, and it was really about the art of doing less and being more productive by really focusing on some core priorities. And it's a really good book, and it actually provides some really helpful advice. The problem is that somewhere in the middle of the book, I just got so angry with it, I stopped reading it. And I got so angry with it because I felt like it really lacked the female perspective. I felt myself thinking throughout the book, gosh, this guy doesn't have to take care of kids. Gosh, this guy doesn't have to navigate all these other landmines that women have to navigate. And as I started to reflect on that book and why I was so angry at it, I started to think about all the other books I had read in my career that were business oriented and realized that so many business books I had read were written by men and really felt like we needed more female perspective when it came to business leadership, when it came to books about leadership in general. Because for the most part, those books are really written by men and predominantly white men. And so, we started on this journey to tell the stories of female leaders. And along the way, we started to see that there were some common themes among the things that they were sharing with us, that there were some things that they all had in common. And that's sort of where we are today, is to be able to share with you some of the things that we're learning from female leaders, from the voice of women. And so I'm excited to share this stuff with you. But before we really dig in, I want to make another couple caveats. I think it's important to say out loud that women are underrepresented in every level of leadership, in most businesses, in most nonprofits, in most educational administrations, and in government, and in lots of different areas. And it actually compounds and gets worse as you climb up the ladder. There's a study annually done by McKinsey Institute where they look at women in the workplace. And the 2019 study talked about what they call the broken rung of the ladder. And really, what that means is that from the time that women enter the workforce, we are promoted at about 60% or less of the rate of men in the workplace from the time that we enter. So, from entry level to that first level supervisor, that first promotion in the workplace, men are promoted for every 100 men that are promoted. On average, about 60 to 65 women are promoted. And so from the very beginning, men are outperforming us, and it really compounds as we climb up the ladder. And so, what we see is that we have a lack of representation in leadership. At the same time, it's important to understand that the business world in particular and the world in general was built predominantly by men, and in particular, white, straight Christian men. And so it's important to understand that this is the environment that we have to navigate. Now, we've made lots of gains over the course of centuries for women and for people of color and for people of diverse backgrounds to be better represented in the workplace, but we have a significant amount of work to do. And so, when we look at that, I think it's important to just say out loud that underrepresentation of women in leadership in the workplace and the fact that the business environment, the nonprofit environment, the leadership environment is dominated by men, there's a lot of reasons for that. And I don't want to oversimplify a really complex problem. And so I think it's important to say that out loud before we really dig into these competencies, because I don't want you to think that I've provided you this silver bullet or this golden key to get more women into leadership positions. I'm merely providing you one tiny piece of a very complex equation of how we achieve better equity in the workplace, not just for women, but for people of lots of diverse backgrounds. And so I don't want to oversimplify the problem. The other thing in all of these conversations and in my work with the women that I've talked to, I think the thing that I've really started to realize is that there's a really important strategy that we have to remember if we want to truly achieve gender equity in the workplace. And that strategy is about understanding that the working world, the business world, the way the economy works is built by men. And if we want to change it, we have to simultaneously do two things. We can't just bust in and say, we are going to dismantle these systems of oppression and bias. And we are going to overcome the male patriarchy and just fix business and just fix the economy and put more women in leadership. We have to really straddle two priorities, I think, if we really want to start to address gender equity, in particular in the workplace. We have to navigate within the existing environment and at the same time work to dismantle systems of oppression and bias that exist in the workplace as it relates to policies, systems, behaviors, leadership, and all these other complex things that are going on. And so we have to do both things at the same time. And so, what I have really learned from these women that we've talked to is that they've gotten really good at doing both things at the same time. They've really figured out the things that they need to do to navigate in male dominated environments, to navigate in a business world that's driven by white men, as well as making more space for women to come after them so that we can start to fix systems, culture, process, and oppressive and bias that exists in the workplace. And so it's really both, and we have a group of women from the last two seasons that span a multitude of generations. And that multitude of generations is really interesting what we see. When we look at our more seasoned female professionals, one of the things that we see is that many of them were the first woman in their workplace, the first woman in their profession, the first woman in their company, and in some regards, the first woman of color, even to be in a position that they're in or be at the company that they're at. And those women worked really, really hard to get to those places and were really intentional about how to get to those places. But what we didn't see from those women is that once they got to those leadership places, they didn't build a fortress around themselves and say, single girls club, nobody else allowed, only room for one. What we saw from so many of those female leaders is that once they ascended into leadership, they understood their vast responsibility to make more space for more women at leadership tables and for more women in rooms where decisions were being made. And I think that's a really important caveat because when we look at the younger generation women that we've talked to, many of them cite female sponsors, female mentors, and female advocates that have been integral to their success and their ascension into leadership throughout their career journeys. Whereas when we talk to the more seasoned professionals, they often cite male mentors or male sponsors. And I don't think that's because more women care about more women ascending into leadership. I think there weren't really any women to mentor them until now. And so I think what we also see is that when women ascend into leadership, we don't just create space for more women, we create space for more diverse voices, and where women are more likely to welcome lots of different diverse voices to the leadership table and welcome lots of different diverse voices into the rooms where decisions are being made. And we've seen that in the experiences of the women that we've talked to. And so I wanted to make a couple of those important caveats before we get to the good stuff, which is what we are calling the female leadership competencies. So when we embarked on this journey, I didn't really honestly know if we were going to see themes. I didn't really know what was going to emerge. We decided to create a set of questions that we asked every female leader so that there was some consistency in the information we were getting. And we were going to let the data tell us what it tells us. And what emerged over the course of the last two seasons of the episodes were 7 common themes. Some of them are significant. And in terms of significant, I mean they show up in multiple ways in every single female leaders episode. And so we've identified 7 themes. We have a couple of themes that are emerging based on some new data we're collecting, but there's 7 core themes that have emerged. What I love about these 7 themes, we're calling them the female leadership competencies. But what I love about them is that they're not just for women, they're for anybody. And I think that's an important note to make, that while we've got this data from female leaders, I really think these are important leadership competencies for any leader. The other thing that I think is really valuable about this is that most of these, all but one of these leadership competencies, are actually things that you can work on. They're actually things that you can get better at, that you can hone, that you can practice, that you can improve upon. These are things that you can actually have control over. I think that there's this impression that there's this X factor or there's this innate skill or ability that really great leaders have that is intangible and also inaccessible unless you're born with it. And what I've seen from every female leader that we've talked to through this series is that these are all things that they point to as critical to their success, as important lessons learned, as important skills that they possess. And they're all things that we can do and get better at. And so that's what's really exciting for me about these, is that they aren't things that you're never going to be able to achieve. They're actually stuff that you can start working on right now. And so over the next 7 weeks, we are going to talk about individually each of these competencies and dig into them in depth each week. And so I'm going to start and just sort of unveil them to you, give you sort of a light brush over them to whet your appetite. And then happy to take some questions in the chat feature. Tell us how you're feeling about the conversation. But each week hereafter, for the next 7 weeks, we'll dig into each individual competency. And so we'll dig into the idiosyncrasies, the data, what we've heard from specific women, and also the existing body of research around some of these skills and competencies that exist outside of our research. And so these are listed in order of strength. And so particularly the first two. The first one is something we call self-advocacy. Now, let me say something. I have a group of girlfriends. We call ourselves the Cocoa Bombs. Long story. A shout out to my Cocoa Bombs. And they are sort of my sounding board for a lot of this stuff. Most of them, all of them actually, are leaders in their professions, they're leaders in their field, they're leaders in their organizations. I respect them a crazy amount. And when I need information and I need them to tell me honestly what they think, I bounce ideas off of them. And I bounced self-advocacy off of the Cocoa Bombs. And they had a really visceral reaction to the words self advocacy. And so don't get turned off yet, because I think self advocacy might be the most important leadership competency that women need to be successful. And I want to explain what that really means. I think women have a visceral reaction to the idea of self advocacy because we are socialized from a really young age to not be competitive, but to be nurturing, caring, motherly, and collaborative in our nature. And when we advocate for ourselves, we often consider those things as boastful or selfish. And I think women have that reaction to this idea of advocating for ourselves because of that. And, really self advocacy popped up in almost every single female leader's episode as something that they did really, really well, and they figured out how to do really, really well. Men are socialized inversely to what women are socialized as. They're socialized to be competitive. They're socialized to be ambitious. They're socialized to go for it and be assertive, where those traits are often seen relatively negatively in female leaders. And so there's sort of this catch 22 that we face as women, because what we've seen from the female leaders is that they got really good at advocating for themselves. But advocacy is about priorities, it's about boundaries, and it's about aspirations and ambition. So it's about the things that you want for your life, for your career, for your family, for your happiness. And it's also about prioritizing those things and setting boundaries around the things that are most important. So when we talk about self advocacy, it's not just promoting yourself in a job interview or applying for a job that you feel underqualified for, or asking for a raise in your annual review for your supervisor, or putting yourself up for a promotion at work. It's also about balance. It's also about standing up for yourself when you're treated poorly, or you feel like you've been treated inappropriately or differently because you're female in the workplace. It's confronting people when there's an issue. It's navigating conflict successfully. So it's not just about being boastful or talking about your accomplishments. It's advocating in all of these different spaces in your life. And so I'm really excited next week to dig into this topic with you, particularly because I think it's such an important and meaty competency, because it covers a whole matter of things. One of my good friends in the Cocoa Bombs, I love her dearly. She's a really important person to me. Her reaction to self advocacy up front was, I'm really good at advocating for my people, and that's what's most important for me as a female leader. And I sort of was taken aback by that, of like, well, what about advocating for yourself? And I think that that's part of the innate nature of female leaders, is that we want to advocate for our people, and we understand our role to be a voice for others that fall under our purview. But I think there comes a point as well where we have to advocate for ourselves just as much as we advocate for the people on our team, or the people that we supervise, or the people that we lead as well. It's natural and innate for us as women to speak up for others. It's maybe not as natural and innate to speak up for ourselves. So, by the way, this female leader, this Cocoa Bomb friend, also is really good at advocating for herself. I just don't think she realized until we had a very lengthy conversation about it, how much she advocates for herself as well. So, some of it is about self discovery more than anything, which leads us to our second competency. Second competency is self awareness. Now, self awareness came up repeatedly with these female leaders that we were talking to. They would say things like, I journal a lot. You have to be really self aware. You have to know what your strengths and weaknesses are. You have to know what you do best. You have to harness what you do best. And I would dig into this question in a lot of these episodes. And I would ask them, okay, well, how do you build self awareness? And a lot of them would point to introspection, journaling, personality type indicators or leadership assessments like Strengths Finder, the Enneagram, the Predictive Index, all these different types of personality type indicators. And when this theme emerged for us, we started to look out in the space about self awareness and try to understand in the body of existing research around self awareness, what does that say about how you build self awareness and how can we help women improve on that? I hate journaling. I've never been good at it. I can't sit down and just write in a book. Even when I'm given like 3 questions to answer every day, I'm still terrible at it. And so we started to look at what the body of research says. And what we learned is that there's a study that they asked people, how self aware are you? And about 85% of people indicated, I'm pretty self aware. Or when they asked, are you self aware? And 85% of people said yes. But through their research, they determined that only about 10 to 15% of them actually were. And this is really about the way our brain functions and the way that we do introspection. We do it wrong, first of all. And second of all, we don't actually have the ability to access our unconscious thoughts and feelings. And so our brains automatically make up stuff that feels true. And so our introspection, our journaling sometimes is creating false perceptions and realities for ourselves. And so, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about self awareness and how we do introspection right and how we build greater self awareness intentionally and accurately for ourselves as women. The third one is courage. And what was really interesting to me, these next 3 were really ones that I wasn't expecting. They were ones that sort of popped out. One could predict that self advocacy and self awareness were going to pop out from these leaders, but the next 3 really were unexpected for me. And courage is really about risk taking. And we had lots of women not specifically say you have to take risks, although we did have a couple of female leaders talk specifically about taking risks. A lot of them would passively talk about taking big leaps in their career, making a big career jump, taking a leap of faith with a company, taking a leap of faith in a new role, stretching themselves outside of their comfort zone, and sort of indirectly talked about this idea of risk taking. And what's really interesting to me is that risk taking behavior is something women are not socialized to do. We're socialized to play it safe, to be careful, to be thoughtful, to be and to be not so risky, right? Where guys are taught that risk taking behavior is actually, sort of fostered to them from a really young age. And I see this play out with my children. I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. And my 2-year-old son put his new bike helmet on the other day and rolled himself down our stairs. And my husband was like, "Hey, whoa, you made it, dude!" And if our daughter would have done that, we would have freaked out. And I think that is a really important indicator. I think for us is that men are sort of encouraged to take risks where women maybe aren't. And what we've learned from the body of research that exists is that we can actually get better at risk taking behavior, and that you can actually get better at stretching yourself and challenging yourself outside of your comfort zone and being better at taking thoughtful and intentional risks. And what we saw in the female leaders that we talked to is that risk taking behavior was something that they were really good at. Number 4 is resilience. And I know that this is like a buzzword. This is something that everybody's talking about right now, particularly because of the pandemic and how everyone's had to pivot. But honestly, this theme was emerging long before I think the pandemic was as thorough of a topic that we were talking about as we are now. And resilience is really about overcoming adversity. It's about doing things that were really, really hard, bouncing back from really, really hard things that happened to them. A lot of women talked about losing a job or getting fired or changing careers or really difficult challenges that they encountered in their career and how they overcame those things. But what makes it resilience and not just overcoming adversity is that so many of these women talked about not just overcoming adversity, but quickly bouncing back from that adversity and using that adversity to propel them to the next stage in their career. We have lots of women talk about and say, actually, I felt like everything in my career led me up to this point. All of the failures, all of the missteps, all of the detours led me to here. And I think that that was such an important theme that emerged that we weren't really expecting, that these women really learned how to take failure, use it as a learning opportunity, and then use it to challenge, propel, and push them to the next level where they accelerated after those failures. And resilience is something we can learn. Resilience is something we can continue to build in ourselves. And so we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. The fifth one, and my personal favorite, is intuition. I cannot tell you how many female leaders that I talked to said things like, trust your gut, follow your heart, listen to your inner voice, trust what your heart is telling you. Your mind will tell you what you need to know. And how many of those women talked about listening to that inner voice? And it emerged, and I was like, what am I going to do with this thing? Like, I mean, like, what? How do you teach somebody intuition? Like, you can't. How do you get better at intuition? I don't know. And when I started to research intuition, what I discovered is that there's actually people who have researched intuition, and particularly female intuition, which is fascinating. But what the data really says is that female leaders are taught and women are taught from a young age to not trust our gut, because the business world, the political world, the economy is built by men. And men are taught to trust data and trust logic. And so the business world and the economy trust data and trust logic. And we don't listen to our guts. And so as women, we are taught really early on to push it down, to squash it, and to trust the data and the logic. But what we see in the data is that this is the most unique innate skill that women are actually statistically research-based proven to be better at than our male counterparts. And this is the unique identifier, the unique value add that we innately bring to the workplace that men do not. And you can't necessarily get better at intuition, but what's important to understand is that you're already good at intuition. You've just been taught to not listen to your inner voice and to not trust your intuition and to instead trust data and logic. And what this one is really about is flipping that script. It's about undoing all of that bad socialization and beginning to trust and listen to our inner voice a little bit more as women, and to voice those things in the workplace and in leadership more. The last two sort of intertwine. And for those of you that know me and have been following me for most of my career, the last two will not shock you. The last two are relationship and communication. I know that's surprising to you all, but it's a little bit different than maybe what you're used to hearing me talk about. When we talk about relationships, the female leaders that we talked to really talked about the importance of building intentional networks of people around them where they had meaningful, nurtured, and long term relationships and network with over the course of time, and how those networks and relationships were able to be leveraged throughout their career at various points. And I think it's not about recruitment, maybe the way that I used to talk about relationship building. It's really about building a bullpen and building a network, a web of people that you're connected to that you can help and that can help you, and building those relationships really intentionally over the course of your career. I'm really excited to dig into this one, particularly with you all, because it's different than maybe what I've talked about before. But I think it's just as important as when we were talking about relationships and recruitment, for those of you that were that know me from my younger years. The last one is communication. And what's been really interesting about the communication piece is, these female leaders understand the minefield that exists for women in the working world related to communication for women. And it's not really about them learning how to communicate in a way that guys can hear it. It's not really about softening their tone or guarding people's egos in the way that they deliver things. It's really about understanding the minefield and knowing what landmines they want to step on and what landmines they want to step around. And so, I think if you looked at any of the female leaders we talked to, all of them are assertive. All of them are direct communicators. All of them understand the minefield that exists for them being assertive and direct communicators. All of them are confident. All of them are really articulate and have presence. And all of them have those skills that you would look for in a great communicator. But what has been important about them is that they've learned how to navigate when to acquiesce. They've learned how to navigate when to lean in and put their foot down. They've learned how to navigate the idiosyncrasies of the way people communicate and how to get people to hear them in the way that they can hear them. I think in a lot of respects, when we look at female leadership in particular, I think so many people over the course of time have sort of scared women away from this idea of female leadership because you either are too emotional and too caring and too much of a pushover, or you're just acting like a guy. And I think women really struggle with navigating, okay, I don't want to have to act like a guy. I don't want to have to act like somebody I'm not, but I also don't want to be penalized for being myself. And I think, I'm not suggesting that we have to act like men. What I am suggesting is that there are some competencies that we can improve upon, and there are some things that we can learn to better navigate in the workplace that will allow us to ascend into leadership positions and also then change those systems that penalize women for that type of communication or that type of behavior or or using their intuition or valuing relationships or wanting to advocate for their people as much as they advocate for themselves. And so it's really about navigating both, and it's really about authentically leading in the way that you best know how to lead, but also understanding that there's certain things that you need to know how to do to navigate in a world that wasn't designed by us, that wasn't created for us, and that wasn't really expecting for us to be there. And so we have to learn how to navigate in it in order to get to places where we can impact how it works for us in the future.